So welcome to Mangalam Research Center's first conversation in our new current series. My name is Karen Myers and I go by she, her pronouns. And I'm the incoming academic director at Mangalam, which is centered here, situated here on Ohlone territory in the city of Berkeley, California. And each month I'll be hosting a conversation with a scholar in Buddhist studies or a related field to talk about current topics of political, social, ecological urgency in light of Buddhist history, thought, culture, and practice, and hence the title of the series, Currents. And I'm extremely pleased this evening to welcome our first guest scholar, Natalie Avalos. And so maybe just say hi, Natalie, so you come on screen.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm so thrilled to see all the folks that have shown up. I see lots of colleagues and friends and even a couple former students.
Great. So many of them know you. So I'll give a little bit short description of you, and later we'll have a little more longer introduction. So Natalie is assistant professor in ethnic studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And she'll be speaking this evening about resisting settler colonialism as Buddhist allies to Indigenous peoples. And so again, welcome, Natalie. And so as I mentioned, in just a minute, I'll ask Natalie to tell us a little more about herself and her work. And then she'll speak for about 30 minutes, followed by a period of discussion with all of you. And we'll provide directions about how to submit questions and comments to join in the conversation with Natalie once she's finished speaking, so it doesn't distract you while she's speaking. While she's speaking, you might have a piece of paper or a note program on your computer handy just to jot down any questions that you have. And then we'll tell you how to submit them when she's done speaking. And so it looks like so far we've got about 75. We had a lot of people register, over 200, and I know some people in different time zones. And so we are recording this evening, and we'll send out information about how to access the recording to the email with which you registered. And so before we go further this evening, I'd like to introduce you to Cynthia, who is a very valued member of our Mangalam's Mindful Living residential program, and did a lot of work helping put this event together. And so, hi, Cynthia, maybe say something so you pop up.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you.
And so Cynthia will be working behind the scenes this evening to help with any technical issues that you have. And then later she'll explain how to submit the questions. And so Cynthia, do you want to tell people how to get in touch with you for technical issues?
Yeah. If anything comes up during the event, feel free to send me a private message. And hopefully I can resolve that for you.
Okay. And then what I'd like to do now is I think as co-host, I can do this, put everyone, we're on gallery view now. And so we can all give a silent Zoom welcome to Natalie. All right, great. And so let's just take a few minutes now to get settled. We'll just sit silently for about 2 minutes, and maybe people will come wander in to the Zoom channel, and we'll just get settled a bit. And so I will alert you. You should hear the beep once the meditation is finished. So just 2 minutes or so of silent sitting to get settled. Okay. So again, welcome, Natalie. And if you could spotlight the two of us now, Cynthia. And then it should be that Natalie and I both appear on screen together at the same time. Is that's happening? Okay, great. And so welcome to all of you also out in Zoom land. And I expect many people here have read your biography, Natalie, but for those who haven't, Natalie is an ethnographer of religion whose research and teaching focus on Native American and Indigenous religions in diaspora, healing, historical trauma, and decolonization. And she also studies Tibetan Buddhism. She received her PhD in religious studies from the University of California at Santa Barbara with a special focus on Native American and Indigenous religious traditions and Tibetan Buddhism, and is currently working on a book called The Metaphysics of Decoloniality, Transnational Indigenities and Religious Refusal, which explores urban and Indian Tibetan refugee religious life as decolonial praxis. Natalie is a Chicana of Apache descent, and she's born and raised right here in the Bay Area. And so Natalie, so we're gonna have a little bit of conversation just to get to know Natalie before going into the formal talk. And so Natalie, you've taken a fairly unusual scholarly path in studying both Indigenous religions and Tibetan Buddhism. And I'm wondering how you first became interested in each of these areas and how you've seen them connected to each other.
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and one that I get a lot because, you know, in religious studies, there's a tendency to go with one tradition and kind of focus deeply, or adjacent traditions. And these traditions aren't necessarily adjacent, but I found resonances. And I think it's because, you know, I started studying Buddhism and practicing Buddhism in my early mid-20s. And I was also at that time an undergrad at Cal. And I was taking some ethnic studies classes. And, you know, ethnic studies is the place where you go if you want to understand the history and knowledge and worlds of non-European American people. So Asian American studies, African American studies, Native American studies. Because I myself am a mixed Native person on both sides and grew up knowing little to nothing about my own Native heritage or identity, and just fragments. So I was taking classes like Native American philosophy, but then I was also taking some Buddhist studies classes. And what I found really fascinating is I learned more about colonization and the colonial history that dispossessed my own ancestors, that it was actually not only still operating in the present in the US and beyond through the Americas, but that it was operating in these really similar ways, and that it was actually inspired, it inspired other expressions of colonialism in other parts of the world. And since I was specifically interested in Tibetan Buddhism, I began to be really curious about the relationship there between China and Tibet, and want to understand even the ways in which Tibetans have been racialized. And we could talk more about this in Q&A with the audience, but the ways in which they had been racialized due to the nature of their own religion. And I found that really fascinating because that was quite parallel with Native people. They were racialized due to their belief systems, due to their epistemologies, and deemed less civilized, primitive, et cetera. And so that really fascinated me. And I thought, I have to do something here, but I'm not sure what, but that just kind of led me on my ethnographic research. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And you just said a word. I was going to ask you about one word in your biography, but I noticed you just said another word that might not be that familiar to some people in our audience. You said the word epistemology in the context of that, that Tibetans as well as Native peoples have been racialized because of, in part because of their epistemologies.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we, the way that I explain epistemologies in the classroom is really knowledge systems, our knowledges, but that can also really include our worldviews, right? So it's not just the kind of knowledge we think of in terms of data, but the way we understand ourselves in relation to one another, the way we view how the universe functions. So epistemology is really a worldview.
Thank you. And then as is mentioned in your bio, you're an ethnographer. And so maybe you could explain what it means to be an ethnographer and how this informs your study of both Buddhism and indigenous religions.
Yeah, so I took an unusual tack in grad school because when you study Buddhism in a more formal setting like that, in a traditional religious studies department, you would generally study texts, translate texts, work with texts, work with philosophy. And that's really important to do and to know. I was not interested in text. I was really interested in how it was that religious worldviews were impacting people, how it was shaping their world, their life, how it was helping them cope with colonial trauma, dispossession, how it was helping them redefine their own power and identity in diaspora. And so I really wanted to, as an ethnographer, you go out, it's an anthropological method. So you go out and you talk to people, you get to know them, you learn their stories, you contextualize it with some history, some geopolitics. But ultimately, I was so fascinated by people's stories because stories themselves are understood to be pedagogical in an indigenous context. Stories are where learning happens, right? And that you learn about not only who you are in the world, but you learn about your possibilities for who you can be in the world through stories. And I think stories also visibilize and empower those in particular who have been silenced. So I felt like it was really important for us to hear the stories of those on the margins who you don't hear as often.
Thank you. That actually brings me to my last question. I'd like to ask you lots and lots of questions, but we need to get the topic tonight. But I wanted to ask you about the idea of a scholar activist. And so, as you know, sometimes academics are criticized for being too removed from the real world concerns, up in their ivory towers. And on the other hand, if they are socially or politically engaged, they can be criticized for not being sufficiently objective or neutral. Right. And so I'm wondering what you think about those criticisms and whether or how you situate yourself as a scholar activist.
Yeah, so I appreciate you asking that. I actually just wrote a public-facing piece talking about just this. In my experience with this in my own field of religious studies. So you'll notice I'm actually housed in an ethnic studies department and not a religious studies department. And I found that when I was looking for jobs and on the market, that was a common criticism. Like, well, how do you as an insider, as someone that's interested, is both a person of Native descent, but also a person that's making normative claims about the communities that you're working with, making political, essentially social political claims. And I think the way in which the Western academic model had functioned, especially in the, the 20th century as it began to really develop, was out of the Enlightenment assumption that we could take an empirical approach to all knowledge production. And that means that you are objective, disinterested, and that's the only way that you can equitably judge and evaluate any set of data, right? Any phenomena. The problem with this is that it assumes that any of us can somehow be removed from the world. We're never removed from the world. We're always engaged and invested. We are always, to call on or draw from that feminist adage that the personal is political, meaning that we are all interpellated by power. And so we were always in proximity to different expressions of power. And we are negotiating that in every instance, in every relationship, in anything we produce. And so luckily, I think in the 80s and 90s, the reflexive turn helped us think more about that, especially in a social science context. But religious studies was a little slower because I think there's this real fear that insiders or practitioners might actually be too biased. And unfortunately, I think we really have to break out of, again, the assumption that there is a neutral voice, partly because this is a very deeply racialized notion. The neutral voice was always the white male voice. It was assumed that that white male voice doesn't have an actual interested position. And we now know that they definitely do. They have a position of power. They have a relationship to power. They can exert power in particular ways, right? So the more we could disabuse ourselves of this myth of objectivity, we can actually do work that is productive and generative and maybe impactful. And ultimately, I think a scholar activist is just someone that cares about what they're studying and realizes that what they're studying impacts the world, and that what you're writing and what you're highlighting and visibilizing for your colleagues, for students, for the world at large can and should be powerful and transformative, and provide us with insights on how we might do better and be better and learn and grow. And I think ultimately that's really an aim we can all agree with, at least I hope. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. And it was really nice to have this opportunity to get a little bit more of your background and understand your position as a scholar. And so I don't know if it's easy to quickly switch to the gallery so we can all, again, another round for Natalie. And then we're going to launch into the talk now. So take it away, Natalie.
Great. So let me share my slides. So I just want to thank the Mangalam Research Center and Karin for inviting me again, because I had written a short article on land-based ethics, and really I had been inspired to write this because I had developed a class called Earth Justice several years ago, and I had developed it in response to Standing Rock. I was trying to get students to understand, well, what was happening there and why was it relevant. I found that most of the students that I worked with were very concerned about environmental crisis. And I ended up writing this piece on land-based ethics because I feel like we have to connect the dots between environmental crisis, really ecological crisis, the possibilities for ecological wellness, and a history of settler colonialism. Because these dynamics are not removed from power, they're steeped in power. So I'll start by helping us think about who Indigenous people are. Essentially, Indigenous peoples are First Peoples. They're the current and living descendants of pre-invasion inhabitants of lands now dominated by others. They're culturally distinct groups. They find themselves engulfed by other settler societies born of forces of empire and conquest. So why I like this definition is because it helps us understand that Indigenous peoples, this is a contemporary definition. It only exists in a contemporary context because of the political relationship. They are characterized and demarcated by this political relationship. And it's a political relationship to settler colonial nations, right? To settler colonial powers. And really in the last 5 to 10 years, we've had a better, we've done a better job in the academy trying to understand what settler colonialism actually is, right? And that it's distinct. There are different kinds of colonialism, but this particular expression seeks to actually eliminate Indigenous populations, right? There are some expressions of colonialism that just sought to manage populations. But in this case, the kind of colonialism that existed in the Americas and that continues to exist in the Americas, in places like Australia, New Zealand, even the relationship between China and Tibet, we could see that the Indigenous populations are really marginalized socially, politically. There are moves not only to physical genocide, but cultural genocide. So the reason why the Indigenous population needs to be eliminated is so that the settler society can essentially manage and monopolize all the resources. And this operates through laws, racist ideologies that essentially become enshrined in law. But importantly, through these naturalized conceptions of land as an object. So we have to remind ourselves, land was not thought of as a commodity by every human society. There are still human societies that do not and refuse to conceive of land as a commodity, as an object. But ultimately, we're living with this legacy of a myth of development, right? That the land must be developed. And this is the only way to progress as a civilized nation. And it seems odd, right? That we have such a naturalized sense, right? That we must develop the world. And of course, this sense of development sits in opposition to Indigenous life. I want to point you to this quote from Vine Deloria Jr. He's a Lakota philosopher, theologian, lawyer. And he says of this myth of development, the most devastating feature of the Western worldview, the destructive notion already forming by the time Columbus arrived, was that Europeans possessed the truth, and it was their job to make sure all people they met on the planet were shown the truth, capital T truth. This confidence, initially buttressed by the domination of the church, that Western civilization represented the highest development of humankind, was central to the Western worldview. Right? So he's essentially telling us that a worldview is what's operating. And so we have to think of settler colonialism and what I have theorized as settler ecologies, what I'm starting to think about as settler ecologies, are really driven by this kind of metaphysic, a worldview that says there's a hierarchy of peoples, and there's a hierarchy of peoples in relation to lands, plants, and animals, right? And again, this hierarchy sits in opposition to indigenous religious lifeways. We can see these religious lifeways as actually very diverse. They're specific to people, they're specific to places. They're characterized really by places because of their sacred and interdependent relationships to land, meaning that indigenous peoples are often described as land-based peoples, that they understand themselves actually as land, as an extension of land, as sometimes even an expression of land, that they are not separate, that they are part of one larger functioning world that has its own rhythms and dynamisms, and that must be understood on a very deep level in order to live well within it, right? So an important concept that I think is integral to understanding land-based ethics is this concept of spirit, right? So indigenous peoples, and particularly in the Americas, is where I'm drawing from here, they may refer to something called spirit. It can be translated as life force. In a Lakota context, it's referred to as Wakantanka, the great mystery, that which is mysterious and beyond human comprehension, that which is actually sentient and aware, separate from human life, but it intersects human life. So this life force is understood to be immanent in the world, and that all the persons within the natural world, the plants, the animals, the winds, the mountains, have spirit. They have this life force. It's their animating principle. And in that sense, it makes all the persons within this world related and actually have the ability to communicate. And in that ability to communicate, it makes them a society, a community, a social body. Right. So bringing you back to a quote from Bindeloria, and the reason why I'm drawing here from some Native scholars is because I think it's important for us to think about these sources and be critical about the sources of indigenous wisdom, because there's some floating around that maybe are not legitimate, right? So I try and bring in legitimate indigenous sources, whether it's elders, community leaders, scholars. Something that Bindeloria says here, he says that Indian world can be said to consist of two basic experiential dimensions that together provide a sufficient means of making sense of the world. These two concepts were place and power, the latter perhaps better defined as spiritual power or life force, right? I just noted that life force is this animating principle. He says, familiarity with the personality of objects and entities of the natural world enabled Indians to discern immediately where each living being had its proper place and what kinds of experiences that place allowed, encouraged, and suggested. Ultimately, what Deloria is arguing here is that places themselves have agency. The land itself has agency. It has personality, multiple personalities. And that as you get to know the personas of the place that you inhabit, it tells you, it works upon you and gives you a sense of what's appropriate there. How do I live appropriately here? What are the plants here that are medicinal plants? Plants that I can eat, plants that I can harvest. Who are the animals here that I must develop a relationship with, that I may eventually hunt or trap or even care for? Right? So it's places that determine your behavior. Right? And this challenges a settler colonial metaphysic that says, well, places are inert, they're object only, material only. Right? Places are sacred for multiple reasons in a Native context. They're understood to be really places of stories. Stories are understood to come up out of the land, the expressions of land. Origin stories, creation narratives. How do you know who you are in the world? Well, your origin story, this original story will tell you, well, we're the people of these 4 mountains. We are the people of these waters. We are the people of this lake, right? And because we're people of this particular place, these are our rules for living. These are the ceremonies that we have. And we conduct those ceremonies in order to minister to the land, minister to the persons in that land. And ultimately, they help people orient themselves to what their responsibilities are in the world. What should I be doing? What is my purpose? What is my telos in this place? So that takes us to stewardship. And this is an idea that has actually gained some public traction in the last few years, mostly because of the no DAPL protests at Standing Rock. And this is actually a picture of a protest that happened several years before Standing Rock. This was the Reject and Protect movement. This movement started to mobilize against the Keystone Pipeline in like 2013, 2014. And it ultimately became one of the first places where the articulation of protectors versus protesters was heard. But at Standing Rock, we really began to hear and understand that there's a difference between being a protester, someone that may be agitating socially, versus someone that their essential purpose, individually and collectively as a people, is to protect a place. And I think sometimes non-Native people don't necessarily understand why forced removal was genocide for Indigenous peoples. When you are disconnected from your place, the place that you built a relationship with over hundreds, thousands of years, you sever that relationship of care. You lose your reason for being to some degree. And so stewardship is really an expression, the deepest expression, individual and collective expression of this kind of care. Vine Deloria would say the way he framed it in his work was, you know, Native societies are a responsibility-driven society. Western societies, it's a rights-based society. For Native peoples, we're responsibilities-based. Okay? So that's really how we can understand Indigenous stewardship. Bringing you to a Buddhist context, one that may be pretty familiar is this quote from Chogyam Trungpa's text, Shambhala text, right? The sacred path of the warrior. He says, too often people think that solving the world's problems is based on conquering the earth, rather than touching the earth, touching ground. That is one definition of the setting sun mentality. trying to conquer the earth so that you can ward off reality. Shambhala vision is based off living on this earth, the real earth, the earth that grows crops and nurtures your existence. You can learn to live on this earth. Even though you may be living in a city in the 20th century, you can learn to experience the sacredness, the nowness of reality. That is the basis for creating an enlightened society. So he says several things here. One is, he's making a critique of this mentality, conquering the earth, really this mentality of development. We must develop the land. The land has to be developed in order for us to be deemed civilized, in order for us to be modern, in order for us to accrue capital and have wealth. So that critique is really important. But he's also saying something else, right? That when you're stuck in a relationship where you're objectifying the land, you're warding off reality. You're losing track of the fact that you're already embedded in the land. You can't remove yourself from that embeddedness. Part of what you're trying to protect yourself from is the volatility of land. You're trying to control it to protect your survival. Ultimately, he's saying the more you can connect with land and see that it nurtures your existence, very similar to the same ethics of stewardship in a native context. That can provide the foundation for your own enlightenment. And again, not just individually, but collectively. Drawing from another Buddhist thinker, Thich Nhat Hanh, he says, our enemy is our anger, hatred, greed, fanaticism, and discrimination against people. If you die because of violence, you must meditate on compassion in order to forgive those that kill you. When you die realizing the state of compassion, you are truly a child of the awakened one. Even if you are dying in oppression, shame, and violence, if you can smile with forgiveness, you have great power. So who is he saying this to? He's saying this to his students and to those in Vietnam who were agitating against the war. And ultimately what he's trying to do is to get them to understand that this agitation can be done in an awakened, mindful way. It can be done with the right intention. It doesn't mean that you turn away from this fight, because fighting injustice is an act of compassion. But how you negotiate this fight is critical. And ultimately, it's this view that helped him theorize what socially engaged Buddhism is and can be. And it helped inspire those that were affected by violence and discrimination and hatred and racism to agitate, but again, do so in a particular way, in a way that understood that agitation as a possibility for enlightenment, not just for yourself, but for your enemy, so that those that are oppressing can understand and see the kind of pain that they too are steeped in, right? And that they are actually responding and reacting out of pain and really out of the illusion of duality. right? So I'll return to this concept, but just to double down on land-based ethics, we can think of land-based ethics here expressed in a Native context and even in a Buddhist context as living in relationship with the land, because you are the land. You're an extension of the land. You're interdependent with the land. The land provides your needs. And in turn, you must tend to the land. In an indigenous context, development doesn't mean raising the land. It means cultivating it with such awareness and care, such deep listening and long-term observation that you actually come to know how it can be best expressed in that particular region, right? In this context, when we think about land-based ethics, something that I really want folks to understand is that when Native people say that they are sovereign, they say this meaning that they are sovereign because of their relationship as stewards to the land, which itself is sovereign. Because again, the land is sentient, it has agency. And the land is understood to have its own sovereignty. And again, in a rights-based society, it can be hard to articulate what that means and how to protect it. There are expressions and great examples of that happening in places around the world. But ultimately, if we understand land as sovereign, then it helps us understand that when we can agitate around ecological crisis, we can do it in a way where we center the land's needs with the awareness the land actually has needs. And by decentering humans in this equation or in this context, it may actually benefit land because humans have their own petty power struggles. And if we recenter the needs of land to just earth justice, earth-based care, then we can collectively agree that we collectively depend on land. So this may be one intervention, right? And part of understanding the land as sovereign, of course, is thinking about how the land teaches us how to live, how plants and animals teach us how to interact with one another, with equanimity, with care, with reciprocation in interdependent ethical ways. Right? So to return to this idea of dissolving dualities, I was drawing from a text on really compassion and contemplation by bell hooks. And in it, she talks about how, as a practitioner, she's been encouraged to dissolve dualities, right? In a Buddhist context, it's understood that dualities are an illusion. The separation between you and I is an illusion. Separation between you and any other is really an illusion. So how do we do this while also still acknowledging structural inequalities and working to eliminate them, right? Because there is some sense, and she notes this in her essay, that we can easily spiritual bypass and say, well, those problems of the world, they're just illusions and they exist out there and they're beyond me. And I don't really have to do anything about them because ultimately I am working on my own practice, my own enlightenment. And that's what's most important. She says, well, for those of us that are marginalized, those of us that don't have the same access to power and privilege, and that are not living in an environment where we're safe day to day, we have to deal with the dissolution of dualities with a lot of love, a lot of patience. And she was recommending that all practitioners think in this way, right? That love itself is a practice. And again, not spiritual bypassing, not, oh, it'll figure itself out on its own. But that love as a practice could mean being interested in one another's experiences of dispossession, being interested in one another's experience of marginalization and silencing, trying to understand the nature of those violences, and then trying to interrupt them in some way, right? And again, she's drawing on Thich Nhat Hanh's socially engaged Buddhism that says love as a practice is also turning towards the world as opposed to away from it when it is in turmoil. And that you can actually direct your practice towards that turmoil. You don't need to necessarily hide yourself from the world. It may be your intervention of love through your practice, the insight and compassion that you provide through contemplation that can actually intervene and may even dissolve some of the violence around us. So being an ally, ultimately, I take both Thich Nhat Hanh's work and Bell Hook's work to help us understand that being an ally to Indigenous peoples means deep contemplation, trying to understand where you are in this equation. What is your positionality? Who am I in proximity to the existing power structures of this land base? How do I benefit from them? How am I complicit in them? How do I negotiate power and actually perpetuate the marginalization of others through that power? Unknowingly, unwittingly. And that contemplation, of course, is supported by education. One of the reasons why I'm so excited about being in an ethnic studies department is because ethnic studies is a place that is intervened on a settler colonial metaphysic, on a settler colonial worldview that says the only valuable knowledge is European American knowledge. The only valuable history is European American knowledge. And cultures and expressions and art and life, right? So what ethnic studies does is it provides the counter histories, right? The histories of Indigenous peoples, their cultural expressions, their worldviews, their contributions to humanity, to African American peoples, Asian American peoples, Arab American peoples, right? In their diversity. So it disrupts this simple equation, right? That there is the West and the rest. So educating yourself about those dynamics, learning about racialization, learning about power, of course, your proximity to power, but also building relationships, getting to know communities, getting to know Native peoples. Who are the first peoples where you live? Do they live nearby? What is their contemporary community like? How might you in your own work support them? How might you uplift and center those Indigenous voices in your everyday life, in your own work? And of course, that's the action piece. How do you use your power to deconstruct unequal structures of power? How do you intervene? And do it in such a way where you are grounded in that contemplative practice, really seeking to create awareness, maybe even among your peers or your family members that don't understand some of these dynamics, and seeing that as an expression of love, seeing that as an expression of care, and really an extension of your own practice. So I'll end thinking about decolonial resistance, right? And decolonization has become a bit of a buzzword. And the way that I try and frame it for students is really the undoing or the dissolution of colonialism. Its ideologies, its institutions, its normative assumptions, right? And of course, settler colonialism, all these embedded assumptions, right? That land is commodity, that there's a hierarchy of peoples. Those are so naturalized. There's such a naturalized dimension of our world. So decolonization intervenes in those assumptions, in those ideologies, and it helps us clarify reality and understand reality. So in a place like Standing Rock, this was an inter-Indigenous fight for survival, survival of not only the peoples, but the land, because again, it was trying to protect waters. It was also a fight for sovereignty. And again, sovereignty of peoples is always connected to the sovereignty of land. What was interesting about this place is that it centered ceremony because in a Native context, speech is understood to be generative, right? It actually determines the material world. So it brings things into being. So the prayer used in a ceremonial context was understood as planting the seeds for future material results. Where do we see this? Yeah, in a Buddhist context as well, right? So there's an interesting relationship there. And if you have questions about this, we'll talk more about this. I'm working on my book right now, but I talk about this in my book. So the allies that were here at Standing Rock, what they did that I found so fascinating and honestly beautiful and incredibly moving was that they leveraged their own bodies to protect Native peoples that were protectors, because they understood that we live in such a racist society that using your own body, that white bodies would not be attacked and beaten in the same way that Indigenous bodies, Native bodies would be. And by using their own bodies as a human shield to protect Indigenous peoples, that was their way of leveraging power in a very real, embodied sense, right? So we can see that as a very committed expression to allyship. But we could talk more about what allyship means. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my slides, and I'll give it back to you, Karen, and we could start our discussion.
Okay, great. Oh, thank you. I have a bunch of questions of my own, but I'm going to let Cynthia come on and explain how people can submit questions since there's so many people on the call. Cynthia, are you there?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Natalie. Sweet. So we're going to use a new tool. So there's a website where we'll be able to all kind of enter in our questions. And then because there's so many of us, as you see questions popping up there, like feel free to give a thumbs up. And then Karen will pull from here. So I'm just going to share my screen just to give a bit more info here. So this is what the website looks like. If you have your phone and you want to do it on your phone, you can just hold it up to the QR code right here. And then it'll pop up on your phone. If not, I'm going to put in the link in the chat right now. So let me do that, copy link.
Yeah, so this is a new feature that well, this is the first time we're doing an event together, but this should enable us. So like if you had a question and it's similar to somebody else's question, you can just give a thumbs up on that question. It'll kind of sort of crowdsource what are the most burning questions. Yeah. And then you, at the same time, if you raise your hand, and that'll float you, I believe, to the top of our participants list, and we can unmute you when I call on you to ask your question. Is that right, Cynthia?
Yeah, yeah. So I just put the link in the chat. So if you go to that link, it'll pull up a page where you can add a question. And in that question box, just underneath it, it'll have the option for you to also like write your name. And that's your choice. If you want to write your name, you can also be anonymous. Yeah, and then feel free to, yeah, I'll show the QR code again. And then feel free to, yeah, give thumbs up on other questions. And then Karen will just pull questions from there. So let me go ahead and share my screen one more time.
Yeah, and we encourage you to put your name. You don't have to, but it'd be good because then we'll call you and you can ask your question yourself and it'll be more conversation-like.
Here we go. So here's the QR code over here. And awesome, already some questions are coming in.
Okay, so I'll queue up one of these questions. I see Susan Degan. Okay, there she is. I'm gonna unmute you. I asked you to unmute you. I think you should be able to come up on the screen.
Hi. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Brilliant. Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this, Natalie. I've been working with ethnography for a while, and I struggle with the same thing that you're talking about this kind of settler colonial ideology of the truth, right? That there is this kind of dominant way of seeing things. And so I guess my question is twofold, which is like, how have you found navigating that in a very colonially minded academia? I know you mentioned you're in ethnic studies, so maybe in ethnic studies it's a little less, but I'm currently in anthropology. So how have you found navigating that? And also, do you have any resources you could share like with those specific critiques that I can kind of follow up on?
Oh yeah, resources. I'll have to think about that. Yeah,
that's no problem.
So I think that, you know, in anthropology, I feel like what's exciting is that they're starting to explore the ontological turn. And I think that this is really a boon. Really, so for the rest of folks out there, the ontological turn is the idea there are multiple ontologies, there are multiple worldviews and knowledge systems from which we can explore and understand ourselves. And so Native and Indigenous studies has been doing this for a while, and ultimately ethnic studies has sought to recenter, you know, well, what's African American knowledge? What's African diaspora knowledge? What is Indigenous knowledge, and how might it be distinct and differ and have different codes and protocols for research, right? So there's already an incredible literature developed there, but in anthropology, because it hasn't been so in tune with what's happening in ethnic studies, I think the ontological turn is its kind of opportunity to do some of that work, right? And I'd say a good resource is actually looking at Indigenous research methods. So Margaret Kovac has a really great book on Indigenous methodologies, and Kovac is, I'll just type that actually in the chat for you. And I think it's really helpful to get us to think about not only just the differing codes of protocol, but also what knowledge looks like. And also the boundaries of knowledge. Because I think, again, in a Western empirical framework that the academy is steeped in, all knowledge should be accessible. Mm-hmm. And in a Native context, not at all. Mm-hmm. That you should not have access to, some knowledge you should not have, you know, not just only certain people in the community can have access and be privy to certain kinds of knowledge. And that maybe you gain knowledge over time based on your life stage, right? And so it provides us with new parameters for what we can know, but also what we should know. And then even more questions on the ethics of knowledge production. And I think that's what's so powerful and generative about some of these discussions around the ontological turn, is really, how do we care for and attend to differences in our knowledge systems, and then the attendant ethics that exists in these multiple knowledge systems, and how do we respect them and negotiate them. And also in an ethnographic context, really, you're so responsible, you're so beholden to the communities that you work with, right? So how do you negotiate these protocols in ways that not only satisfy their needs, and maybe even speak to a particular community need, right? That scholarship isn't just extractive for the sake of knowledge production, right? For the sake of data creation, but that it might support them and their needs in some way, right? So thinking about all these ethical things. And ultimately, I think Native and Indigenous Studies has been having these conversations, so those might be the best resources. And you're more than welcome to email me, and I'm happy to send you actually a longer list. But the first one that I think of is Margaret Kovac's Indigenous Methodologies. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
So I see a couple questions here related to Buddhist practice. And I see one by Haley. Haley did not raise their hand, but I can unmute you, Haley, if you'd like to ask your question. Otherwise, I'll read it. So I'm asking you to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm happy to ask my question. Thank you so much for letting me ask this question. And also thank you so much for your research and your work, Natalie, and this talk. What a multifaceted investigation. My question is just about how a Buddhist understanding of non-self or fundamental emptiness would align or relate with a Native understanding of land ethic, or an Indigenous understanding of how Great Spirit relates with land, and basically how human identity is constructed, whether those two understandings are you know, just exploring the relationship between those two understandings.
So that's a good question. That's something that I'm actually actively trying to work out in my manuscript. So I'm glad you raised it. I don't know if I have it resolved. You know, something that I found so fascinating was the parallels in terms of conceptualizations of interdependence and the ways in which those in a Native context are very land-centered. But the way that I started reading ethnographies of Tibetans, already having a context for Indigenous relationships with land, I began reading them through that lens. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I think they're, you know, maybe scholars aren't centering it, but it seems to be there. And when I got to CU Boulder, I initially came a couple of years ago, I started talking with this Tibetan grad student who's a PhD student in anthropology. Her name's Dawa. And we had this conversation about like land land-based ethics. And she's like, oh yeah, this is what's happening. Like, that's how Tibetans view land, is like in this very embodied way, in this very like deeply enmeshed way, interdependent way. And I was like, so I'm not just projecting, because I was concerned that I was projecting my ideas. And so I was hesitant. And it was so wonderful to be in conversation with her. And I think ultimately, you know, the funny thing was I cited her blog. She has this blog, the Lakar Diaries, and I cited her blog in my dissertation. And I got to tell her, oh, I cited you, you know. But to build that relationship, and that's part of the real boon, I think, of doing ethnographic work, is to hear how people are interpreting these kinds of concepts, how they're applying them. Because, you know, Buddhist conceptualizations of no self, that's not something that your everyday Tibetan practitioner of Buddhism may understand on a very, very deep level, but there is a cultural context for what that may mean, right? And so I was interested in what the cultural expressions were. And I think for Western practitioners of Buddhism that are doing that deep dive, that deep philosophical dive, it can provide you with a sense that even though there is no permanent innate self, that the social context from which you live can and should still be intervened upon due to the possibility for engagement, right? That social engagement. And so, as I touched on in my talk, I think there might be some reluctance from Buddhist practitioners to engage on that level because they are working towards that no self. And they may feel as if working towards that no self in practice means, again, turning away from the world. And it really doesn't have to. I think ultimately, I don't have the answer for what that looks like. I think, you know, I would ask the audience and say, what's possible? How might you apply that concept of no self to your life through your practice and do it in a way in which it's engaged? So sort of answers your question, maybe not totally, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
So there's an anonymous question here, but feels very central to the talk. And I'll just say in terms of the question, so I'm looking at what's getting the most thumbs up in the polling, but also the ones that are most relevant to the conversation this evening. And so this one seems very relevant. It's, can non-first peoples become land-based people? What, you know, can settlers become land-based people? What Buddhist understanding and practices support this? So that feels very relevant to the presentation.
Thank you. What a great question. So we're all land-based peoples because we're all living on land. We're already land-based. We just haven't perceived ourselves as land-based because our relationship with land had been severed by that power structure, right? By the settler colonial power structure and the way it materializes in institutions and laws, but also through ideologies, right? And I should say, you know, it's not a secular worldview. I think that it's actually a Protestant. There's a Protestant dimension, there's a Christian dimension to settler colonialism, and that there's a hierarchy in the kind of like early modern Christian world. And I'm not a scholar of Christianity by any means, but the way that I have come to know Christianity, other than my own colonial experience of it in my family, is how it was imposed and enshrined into law against indigenous peoples, right? So something like the doctrine of discovery, for instance, was a Catholic framework for understanding lands to be empty of Christians, so thus open to dispossession, right? And the doctrine of discovery became enshrined in US law, right? And so our relationships to land are contingent on these not quite secular legal fictions that are bound up with this hierarchical relationship to land, right? So ultimately, we all, wherever our peoples are from, have a connection to land. And all we have to do is recognize that land is sentient and aware. And I think that many of us, something that Vine Deloria said that was so profound, and I keep drawing from him because he really was my inspiration in Native studies, and I still really just am inspired by his work. He said it's not that non-Native people don't experience the land as aware and full of personality. It's that they don't have an intellectual framework to understand it that way. We have foreclosed that framework from ourselves through ultimately our move to try and be objective and produce knowledge in a quote unquote neutral way. And in some ways that's become probably the most harmful move that could have been made in the West. Because when you don't even have a framework to discuss, and I think that this is where the real intervention is here, by developing, land-based ethics as indigenous, but also non-indigenous is really a global, the global possibilities for these land-based ethics. It provides an intellectual framework for what that is, for that expression, for that negotiation, for that relationship. And I think that we can and should all have access to that and figure out how do we do it in a respectful way. We don't have to appropriate any Native ceremonies because, again, Native religious life is specific to them, their places. We don't have to take on anything that isn't ours. But there is, part of what I'm arguing in my book, there is a larger metaphysic that is being spoken to and about. And it's clothed in these culturally specific ways. But it is forcing us to redefine and explore that relationship to land in a much deeper way. Again, yeah, thank you.
There's several really good ones here related. Although people have not been raising their hands. So if you asked a question, maybe you could raise your hand also in the Zoom. And so there's one here, Pearly Wong. And this seems quite relevant to the ecological question. And so I'll maybe read it out for time's sake. And so it says, can you speak more about transnationalism? Do you see any collaborative potential in the broadest sense among Indigenous people, religious groups, and the world? And I think around the world.
Yeah.
And so maybe a little bit on the transnational Indigenous movement and its relevance in this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. That to me is actually the most heartening and exciting thing about our current moment, is that there is so much mobilization in a global Indigenous context, and the kind of inter-indigenous. You know, I described what happened at Standing Rock as inter-indigenous because you had not only Lakota, Dakota people there, because those were their lands that standoff was taking place, but you have, so in the US, you have over 500 Native tribes. And so you had representatives of probably more than half of these tribes went to Standing Rock, right, to stand in solidarity. But then you had people, First Nations people from Canada, you had you know, Maya, Papil, Purepecha people from Mexico, Central America, Quechua people from Bolivia, you know, Sami people from Northern Europe. There were people coming, converging, and it became, you know, I described it as a place that was coalescing power through ceremony, because there was this common understanding that, you know, we could put our forces together. We could put our heads together to strategize, but really it was like, let's put our hearts together through ceremony collectively. And since that time, but really even before that time, I think really for decades, this has been percolating with the Zapatistas, with different expressions of indigenous autonomy. Really conversations at the UN that started in the late 70s and early 80s is what helped define what contemporary indigenous peoples are, right? They themselves were showing up and having conversations with one another on what it means to be indigenous and defining that term among one another and finding the common political needs and strategies, sharing strategies. And I think because we have social media, and the strange thing about quarantine is that people are so connected via Zoom, I've witnessed the most incredible webinars in the last few months with indigenous peoples from different parts of the Americas having conversations about protecting lands, about changes in their ecologies, what their strategies are. And ultimately, this is an incredibly powerful movement, especially because, you know, it's transnational. And I think we're in a moment where the nation state has kind of reached its expiration point. We're seeing the dissolution of basically US empire now. And I think a lot of people are very sad about it. I personally am not. I'm rejoicing. But I think there are lots of folks that feel scared, you know, worried, because we don't quite know. It's like we're trying to figure out what's around the bend, and we don't see what's around the bend. But I think for those that are plugged into these transnational movements, it's exciting because you see that it's these bottom-up movements, it's these on-the-ground movements that are starting to establish through mutual aid, through their incredibly refined social ethics and political leadership that's really lateral political leadership as opposed to hierarchical political leadership. They are already providing a framework for the new world that we're entering into. And I think that that is really just inspiring. And so that's what I'll say about that. Thank you for that question.
Okay, just to keep with our time, we just have about 7 minutes left, and we have a few announcements. And then also Cynthia will come on and talk a bit about how you can support programs like this, and also offer some generosity to Natalie for spending time with us this evening. So I think I'll just ask one more of these Buddhist related questions. And I want to acknowledge that in the questions, there's some really interesting and complex ones, and they're totally good, excellent questions, but maybe go a bit beyond the topic of today. And would just take too long to answer. And so that's why I'm not calling them. So there's one question which, where did it go? Oh, there it is. How do Buddhist understandings of impermanence relate to Indigenous understandings of temporality of land. And here I might say, in the relationship to the land.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I think that's so funny that someone asked that. So I find that right now, so my sister passed last week, and I have been in deep grief for about a week. But what has helped me so much is my own practice around impermanence, as well as the literature that I'm steeped in all the time around really the dynamism of life, the dynamism of the natural world. And so in a Native context, there's this really brilliant book written by a Pueblo scholar named Greg Cajete, and it's called Native Science, The Laws of Natural Interdependence, which sound incredibly Buddhist already, right? But he's essentially arguing, he was a field scientist and botanist, and he wanted to develop a science book for Native students because in a Native context, there's nothing static about the land or the world. It's so dynamic, and that you are something that he notes in it. And there's a Blackfoot scholar, Leroy Little Bear, that talks about how, Blackfoot language and many other Native languages are verb-based as opposed to noun-based. And so you're always thinking of yourself, your whole worldview is determined by relationality. And so you're in a moving, dynamic world. And so in a Buddhist context of impermanence, we know that nothing stays the same. Our lives change day to day, sometimes rapidly, right? Within one day. Our social circumstances, our relationships, life, death, this is all coming and going. And in a Native context, it's understood that you basically, part of how you live a good life, in a Navajo context, or I should say Diné context, it would be described as walking in beauty. And it's really learning to sit back and observe and just accept all those changes and receive them and be a part of them. Find the space where you intervene, where your particular contribution lies, but that you don't have control of your world. The land itself and the world beyond you is more conscious and more wise than you. And so you trust its processes, and that you come to know it so intimately so that you figure out how to live well within it. But you're deeply attuned to the fact that you have no real control over it. And I'd say that ethic is very parallel, similar to kind of ethic of Buddhist impermanence. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for the stimulating conversation this evening. And there's lots of so much more to go into. And I see on the questions. And so I want to say, maybe Cynthia, while I'm talking and saying a little bit about upcoming programs, because I know people have to go in a minute, maybe you could put the link for donation in the chat. And so Cynthia will put, if you want to offer a donation for Mangalam programs, and also we'll be sharing this with Natalie for giving us so generously her time this evening. In terms of upcoming programs, I'd like to alert your attention to the next Currents conversation. And so this is November 19th at 5:30 Pacific time, 8:30 Eastern. And I'll be joined by Emily McRae, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of New Mexico, and she'll be talking about a very timely topic, anti-mask sentiment. So mask in terms of our COVID masks that we're wearing in light of Buddhist ethics and delusions about the self. So that'll be an exciting conversation. And then I'm also pleased to announce that if you had questions, Natalie's going to be back with us. And so Natalie will coming back to Mangalam virtually in March as part of a colloquium on decolonizing Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhist studies. So if you had burning questions this evening we did not get to, you'll have plenty of time during this colloquium to get into some of those questions. And so the colloquium actually has its origins in a panel that Natalie and another colleague put together for a conference in 2019, about 1,000 years ago, it feels. And the colloquium will be a bit like this evening, but with 8 speakers and on a range of topics related to decolonizing Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhist studies in the academy, and sort of the implications, the larger implications for this, and how we study, practice, and teach Buddhism. And then, so the live sessions for the colloquium will be March 20th and 21st. And there will be multimedia materials and presentations related to the topic ahead of time. And maybe we'll figure out a way to start the conversation and questions going ahead of the event. So, so look forward to a longer conversation on this topic. And if you are registered for this event, we'll send you the details about that, times and where to get the materials, where to register, and all of that in the coming months. It'll be about mid-December probably that we'll have all that ready for you. So is there, Cynthia, did you have anything else that you needed to add?
No, that's everything. I got it wrong a couple times, but the correct link is in the chat, the PayPal link. And I also included the link for Emily's event. So the link for the Eventbrite for November's talk is in the chat as well. Thank you.
Great. Well, okay, let's give Natalie a final round. Actually, we can clap. We can make sound on Zoom. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming this evening and your wonderful questions.
Yeah, thank you for coming and thank you for having me.
Great. All right. Well, hopefully we'll see you at our future, either the colloquium or next currents talk. Okay. Bye.